Thank you very much for joining us, and a very warm welcome to today's session when we'll be discussing China's new privacy laws and how they affect your data collection. Thank you for logging in this afternoon, especially to everyone in Victoria who are very excited to be out of lockdown and have just had a very well-deserved public holiday for Cup Day. I'm Virginia Birrell, the National Executive Officer of the Australia-China Business Council and the CEO of ACBC Victoria. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today from all the locations around Australia and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We've organised today's special ACBC briefing to keep our members and our network on top of recent very important policy shifts coming out of China. We want to equip you with timely and relevant information so you feel confident in your business decisions and strategies, particularly for those businesses who will be involved in the China International Import Expo beginning at the end of this week. Many online today will be aware that China has historically had a patchwork of laws containing different data protection requirements for all businesses operating in their country. Introduced this year, the Personal Information Protection Law, along with the Data Security Law, mark two major regulations arriving amid a broader tightening on industry from Chinese regulators. And these have impacted corporations from banks and universities to large, medium and small enterprises. From August this year, these laws have hit e-commerce giant Alibaba, China's biggest ride-hailing company, Didi, and media and games company, Tencent, and have caused their share prices to plunge. To learn more about these laws and to provide context on China's current policy and business environment, I'm very pleased to introduce Daryl Guppy. Daryl is a well-regarded China market expert and wears many hats. He has an international financial technical analyst expertise. He's a regular media commentator and author of 12 books on stock market trading techniques and doing business in China. He's a frequent speaker at ASEAN and APEC conferences in China and has spoken on Belt and Road policies in China, Singapore and Australia. Daryl has worked with the Chief Minister's Department of the Northern Territory and with other senior Northern Territory ministers on China matters. He provides weekly Shanghai Index analysis for Chinese mainland media for more than a decade and appears regularly on CNBC Asia. He's a national board member of the Australia-China Business Council and president of the Northern Territory branch, from where he is joining us today. Now, before I hand over to Daryl, I just want to remind you, you are welcome to use the Q&A box to ask questions during Daryl's presentations, and we'll get to those during the final minutes of the session today. So without further ado, it's over to you, Daryl. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much there, Virginia. Welcome. Today I want to talk about the new privacy laws that China's introduced and the way that that can impact on the way that we decide to do business either in China or with Chinese consumers. There are four issues I want to discuss. I want to look at how they fit into the Common Prosperity Policy Framework and what you can do to prepare and how you can protect your personal online privacy in the China environment. But more importantly, what do these mean for Australian business and how will they impact on cross-border e-commerce and business looking to establish an in-market presence? The rules are changing. China's focus is changing. And what we need to do today is to start with a bit of a broad overview. What's important to understand, first of all, is the context of these changes, because they won't be the last changes. These changes set the scene for further changes and further modification and consolidation of the Chinese e-commerce and digital environment. So I'm going to start with an overview of where these regulations fit in. But in the distance, be warned, there is a text-heavy mountain coming up towards the end of these particular presentations. So although we start with the overview, it's going to get more detailed as we go on. So we need to start with the idea of common prosperity. Now, I know that's sort of dismissed out of hand in many Western commentaries, but it represents an important change in the way that China is approaching the building up of the society and the way in which it's going to proceed in the future. Now, we're all very familiar with the idea, often repeated, that China's done a wonderful job in lifting people up out of poverty, and that's certainly true. But on the other side of the coin, the trickle-down economics approach hasn't really worked. It's resulted in a concentration of wealth at upper levels. So the challenge becomes for President Xi to close the gap between the rich and the poor, between those who have come out of absolute poverty and those who are living in absolute and obscene wealth. So some of what's happening is part of this pressure to reduce the gap between the poor and the rich. It's a rejection of Deng Xiaoping's idea that wealth will trickle down. It represents some important changes in thinking, and we're likely to see this coming through in the 6th plenum coming up in November as well. So we have to look at how the society is changing. And it's more than just how the society is changing, because we have to change some of the ways that we think about China. So, for instance, when we talk about China privacy, we tend to think that's a bit of an oxymoron. We say that there's no data privacy when we compare it to the West. We've got to get rid of that idea, because how does this concept of data privacy fit into this common prosperity framework? Data privacy in China is becoming much more of an issue. Now, we need to remember there's a distinction between the way that government can access data privacy and the way that commercial interests can access data privacy. In our Western thinking, they tend to be much the same thing, two sides of the same coin. In China, it's quite different. And in China, the idea that the state can invade your data privacy, that's a given. What's important is the restrictions that are being placed onto the way that commercial entities can invade your data privacy. We have to be a little careful about how we think about this, because there's a tendency to think that we're much, much better in terms of data privacy than China is. But the reality is that perhaps there are not quite so many differences. So when we move into the China environment, we can't make the assumption that what they're doing is radically different to what we're doing. Let me explain a bit further. In our own environment, surveillance is a fact of life. The results are used in a capitalistic way, or they can be used for effective state management. Now, we use it in Australia for effective state management as well. So JobKeeper, rolled out with COVID, was based on real-time retail data. And this was a transformation of the Australian Bureau of Statistics sparked by COVID-19. It led to the release of monthly business turnover figures for the first time, and they were taken directly from the tills in Woolworths and Coles. The new turnover indicator was based on business activity statements provided to the tax office and covered 13 out of 19 industry divisions. This represented a major change in the way that we were able to manage the economy. Surveillance capitalism is a fact of life in our own environment. And the war on terror has this boiling frog effect. We have accepted greater and greater and greater levels of surveillance and data control. Now that's important, because when we move into the Chinese situation, we can't just dismiss this as something that's coming from an authoritarian state and that therefore we are much better off and we don't have to really worry about what's going on. In fact, in many ways, it's very similar to what's happening in here, because far from implementing a command and control surveillance state, China is rapidly building a tech and trading economy for the 21st digital century. The reality is that Australia has no effective data protection laws. They're nowhere near as strong as the United States, for instance, which is one of the reasons that the breaking of the international pedophile ring took place in Australia, because Australia was able to do things that the Americans were not able to do. Australia's personal data protection laws are pretty weak. You could drive a kangaroo through them well and truly. So when we think about the data protection laws in China, we don't want to be looking down on them. We need to accept that what they are trying to do is very similar to what we have done, and in fact, in some ways, even less than what we've done in terms of personal data protection. And we need to take that into account when we look at the way that we structure any applications, requests for data, or consumer data scraping that we do in the China environment. China has carefully watched the role that social media plays in political discussion and in social unrest in the United States. And this is also one of the issues that's driving their reaction to data privacy and the way it's used and the way that data that is collected by the social media giants is used. Like all governments, they're worried by the way that social media can lead to social instability. Yes, we always say that President Xi is worried about social instability. Well, so's Premier Andrews. So's Mr. Dutton. So's Macron. So is any political leader. They're always worried about instability, and particularly and increasingly the role that social media can play in this environment. It comes back to data collection, who collects it, who uses it, how it's used, and how it can be controlled. In a Western environment, it's very much in the hands of commercial entities, and that's something that China wants to avoid. That sets the framework for the new laws that are being introduced. Part of this framework rests on the idea of social credit. Now, it's a much maligned concept when it's applied to China, but in reality, it's not much different to what we do as well. The primary difference is that our social credit tends to be negative. The best example, perhaps, is points on your license. You can very easily lose points, but how do you get points? It doesn't matter how many years you've been a good driver, you won't be able to add any extra points to your license. But do something wrong and you lose those points immediately. The same with the anti-vaxxers. If you get vaccinated, what's the reward? There's no social credit given to that. But if you don't get vaccinated, then there are a whole range of penalties that apply. The same applies to credit ratings. It doesn't matter how many times you meet your credit payments, it's only the credit defaults, the time you miss the payments, that count towards your unofficial social credit rating. Now, the difference is perhaps that this is carried across multiple sources rather than assembled in one place. But bear in mind, there is no escaping. We operate a system of social credit, but it tends to be on the negative side. One of the risks that comes through the use of artificial intelligence in loan applications is it creates a line of credit barrier because the credit applications are based on the middle class applications and they exclude a whole range of other groups in the community. So whether we like it or not, social credit exists in one form or another. That means that we should not be automatically rejecting the idea of social credit and the role that it plays as a basis for some of China's data and data collection laws. With every transaction we do, every electronic transaction, that data is collected. It's collected by organisations, by companies, by groups, and that data is then, particularly in our environment, collated and resold to a variety of different organisations. It's a capitalist approach to data management. China has moved to a largely cashless society, and that's accelerated under COVID and COVID lockdowns. Now, one of the key advantages of that is that economic data is instantly available. That allows for more effective and informed economic decisions. As we noted before, we saw the same thing develop in Australia, where the ATO had access to retail data coming through on a monthly basis, and in fact even more rapidly than that. And they were able to use that to inform the decisions that they were making around COVID, COVID benefits, JobKeeper, etc. Now, with the rollout of a digital currency in China, DCEP, then we're going to see a greater understanding of the economic forces at play, the exact impacts in real time of policy decisions, of policy experiments on a regional and provincial level. And essential to that is the control of data, the collection of data. China has made the decision that the collection and use of that data cannot be left in the hands of the tech giants. And that's the most important difference between the personal information protection laws in China and what they are designed to achieve, and any similar legislation in the European Union or in Australia. So what I've tried to do here is give you a broad overview of the context on which this privacy legislation and laws are based. Now it's time to see if we can wrestle the conversation back to a more direct understanding of these impacts. What do these changes mean for Australian business? How will they impact on cross-border e-commerce and for businesses that are looking to establish an in-market presence? These are the issues I want to consider for the remainder of this discussion. The first thing to acknowledge is that the impacts on Australian companies and Australian businesses doing business in China is largely at this stage collateral damage. These regulations are largely aimed at networks and network providers, but their regulations will impact on you. Now, PIPL, the Personal Information Laws, applies to data processing outside of China where it concerns the processing of personal data of any Chinese resident for the purposes of providing goods or services to Chinese residents or analysing or evaluating Chinese residents' consumer behaviour. That's pretty important. The regulations apply to data processing outside of China, where it concerns the processing of personal data for any Chinese residents for the purposes of providing goods or services. What's that mean? We become collateral damage to a broader network control environment that's within the China situation. It means that when we sell widgets or services into China, that we fall under these regulations. At a most basic level, this is where it's going to hit us. The first change is that the old method of collecting consumer leads has changed. We can't use put your card in the fishbowl method, or the electronic equivalent of it. We can't scrape data in the same way that Cambridge Analytica did. The data controls are similar to the EU controls in their general data protection rules. The latest move is a new privacy and consumer protection law. Now, this law is similar in many ways to GDPR in the European Union, and it will give Chinese citizens significant consumer protections. But it goes further than consumer protection because there's a huge emphasis on national security. In other words, data. Where is it and who controls it? The new law requires that all data, including user data, broadly defined as critical information, is to be stored in China. Now, this has big ramifications for non-Chinese tech firms operating in China because the new law prohibits foreign law enforcement agencies from accessing the data of Chinese nationals without going through a very onerous approvals process. This is going to impact on the big end of town. Take Apple, for instance. What used to be the most valuable company in the world, Tesla's just overcome that, has around a fifth of its business in China. It's going to have to change the way that it operates in that environment. We have to change the way that we operate in that environment. Some of it will come through the networks. They won't allow us to do certain sorts of things. But one of the primary impacts is going to come in the way that we collect consumer data. If we're participating in CAAE, for instance, or in any other trade show, typically we will run some event, some competition, or put out a fishbowl and collect name cards. The objective is to build up a database of future contacts so that we can follow up with offers, with suggestions for service, with services, with goods. I mean, it's basic marketing 101. The question becomes whether that still remains possible when you're collecting that data from Chinese customers. That's the impact it's going to have on us as individuals, as distinct from the larger tech companies like Apple and WeChat, Alibaba, etc. So that leaves us with 5 questions that I want to look at in perhaps a bit more detail. First of all, what consumer data can you collect? When can you collect that data? And how can you use consumer data once you've collected it? What are the cross-border impacts of that data collection and its use? And what should we do to ensure that we are compliant? What steps should we take? Who should we talk to? What moves do we need to make? Let's look at those in a little bit more detail. Now, I should warn you that this is the start of the text mountain that I talked about in the beginning. We had a look at the broad issues involved. Now we get down to some detail. So the key question is, what consumer data can you collect? We are accustomed to the idea of, do you want chips with that? We're used to upselling. Now the PIPL makes this more difficult, because the PIPL does not only apply to the activities of processing personal data within the PRC, but it also applies to data processing outside of the PRC. It applies when the data concerns the processing of personal data of any Chinese resident for the purposes of providing goods or services to Chinese residents. We're selling goods via WeChat into China, and we're collecting their data, and we're building a database of that so that we can sell them subsequent services or subsequent goods. We now fall under this regulation. It includes analysing or evaluating Chinese residents' behaviour. That doesn't affect me, so you say. I'm only selling them baby milk or goat's milk powder or something similar. But as we move forward and start supplying longer term services, particularly in the health and the aged care sector, then we will inevitably collect data regarding the behaviour of Chinese residents and use that to manage health solutions and health outcomes. That means that the collection and use of that data falls under this legislation. Now, I'm sorry, some of this information will not be relevant to some of you in the audience. For the smaller companies that are involved purely in e-commerce and e-selling, some of this isn't relevant. But for larger companies that are looking to provide long-term services into China, health is one area, education is another area, even accounting and professional services, then PIPL has major impacts because it applies to entities, including entities that do business entirely outside of China, that collect, store or use or transmit or provide or otherwise handle personal information belonging to people within Chinese borders. technically they're called personal information handlers. And the companies outside of China must establish a dedicated entity or representative to be responsible for PIPL compliance. Now, if you're working in Europe, you're already compliant with GDPR requirements. So that gives you a bit of an advance when it comes to PIPL requirements. However, although PIPL is modelled on the EU environment, it's not exactly the same. GDPR compliance will not always pass muster under the PIPL regulations. So for example, companies that rely on GDPR's legitimate interest provision as a lawful basis for processing employee data will note that PIPL does not have a similar provision. The circumstances under which individuals must be notified under the two regulations are different. PIPL requires explicit notice to be provided before data collection occurs. In other words, it's an opt-in environment, not an opt-out environment. And for companies, perhaps the most important differences between PIPL and GDPR come from PIPL's data transfer restrictions. Now, these provisions build on China's cybersecurity law and their data security law. And they really establish a protectionist, security-focused framework which has particular implications for data localization, where data can be stored on servers in China. Now, for most of us, that's not going to worry us. For some ACBC members, these will become issues that have to be dealt with. However, as a general statement, we can say that the EU data protection laws are similar to, but not the same as, PIPL. Similar, but not the same. Now that's important because the services that we can offer in Europe that are compliant with their GDPR regulations will not necessarily be compliant with the PIPL regulations in China. I can't give you the exact details, but we need to be aware that those differences are there and make adjustments accordingly. And this comes down to when can you collect data. The new law requires app makers to offer users options over how their information is or is not used, such as the ability not to be targeted for marketing purposes based on personal characteristics. Now, this goes to the very heart of consumer data harvesting. I know that you've bought a set of hiking boots. That means that you could be interested in a backpack, in a tent, maybe accessories for four-wheel drive. And in a Western environment, that's where our next upsell marketing comes from. But PIPL specifically rules out that type of upselling unless the consumer has opted in. It's a very, very significant change to the way that we go about building our consumer database and expanding our client base. Think of it in an accounting perspective. Yes, we've done some accounting services for you. Now, would you like us to do some audit services or some tax services? Unless the client has opted in, you cannot make that offer under PIPL. Now, at the moment, it says if you have an app, you have to offer those options. But even just normal sales appear to fall under this category. It also places requirements on data processors to obtain consent from individuals in order to be able to process sensitive types of data, such as biometrics, medical and health data, financial information, and location data. Think about these carefully. This has an impact on the provision of health services, the way that we use software to monitor health outcomes and health developments, medical outcomes and medical developments. This places some limitations on the way that we might develop software or apply software within the Chinese environment. Opt-in becomes particularly critical. In terms of financial information covers a host of areas. It can be personal income information. It can be company income information. It can be investment advice information. Unless the consumer has opted in, then we can't offer those types of services. Now, any Western company doing business in China that involves processing citizens' personal data has to also come to terms with the extraterritorial jurisdiction, the reach of China's laws. It means that foreign companies will face regulatory requirements such as the need to assign local representatives and report to supervisory agencies in China. It's no different to the European model. However, the mechanics of doing that, of appointing a representative, of producing and generating reports, is likely to be far more difficult than in the European situation. Okay, I can see how that's going to impact the large companies, but I'm only a small operator. I'm not interested in doing all of that sort of stuff in China. I'm not that large. But when you stop for a moment and think about how the structure of your service or product is built not just on a one-time sale, but on adding additional sales to existing customers, then PIPL has potential limitations on your ability to do this type of marketing activity in the China environment. How you're going to incorporate opt-in or opt-out mechanisms within your selling channels, within your promotional channels and your advertising channels becomes a significant issue. It's something that cannot be ignored. Now, certainly, if you're operating under the umbrella of WeChat or Ant Financial or something similar, then those platforms themselves will impose limitations on what you can do. So to some extent, you can hand the responsibility across to the platform provider. But if you're not aware of the limitations that the platform provider has to impose, then you may spend a lot of time developing processes that cannot be used within the China environment. Some of the processes we use in the Australian environment can no longer be directly transferred to a Chinese regulatory structure. So how can you use the consumer data that you've collected? It's important to remember what China's doing. China's not only breaking up companies, but it's also breaking open the data hoards that made those companies dominant in the first place. It's like breaking up AT&T, the telephone provider in the United States, in the second half of the last century, and created a whole range of baby bells. Now we're seeing some pressure in the United States to do this to Facebook and Amazon. It's unlikely to take place. Breaking up those tech giants is going to be exceptionally difficult. But China's moving along those lines. We've already seen that with action taken against Didi, against Tencent, WeChat, etc. The Chinese companies will be required to share the data they have gathered. That's not just with the state. The state obviously forces them to share that data. By the way, in the same way that the Australian government can force companies to share the data with the Australian government when security purposes is at risk. We are no different from China in that sense. The state, the Chinese state, will have access to the data, but apparently, from what we can see in the legislation at the moment, companies will also have access to that data so they can use it for competitive purposes. Now, that's no different to what we're seeing in terms of the fintech push in being able to access bank data for portability between the banks. The China State Administration of Market Regulation has also proposed additional regulations. That includes prohibiting the use of data algorithms and other technical means, quote, to influence user behaviour or hijack traffic or interfere or impose barriers to the operation of other internet service providers. There is one important point here. China recognises that reining in unsupervised consumer-facing monopolies promotes customer welfare, and it also promotes technological advancement that in turn supports national security. In other words, the systems, the payment systems, cannot be dominated by just one or two players. There is a forced breaking up that's taking place. The data protection laws are part of that process because it takes away the monopoly control that used to be exercised by WeChat and others. However, it also impacts on the way that we can effectively use that data, particularly in a cross-border environment. The law impacts in a cross-border environment in three important ways. First, it affects those companies that are in possession of a large amount of personal information about Chinese consumers. That probably doesn't impact on most of us at this stage. But if you're an Estia Health, if you're an education provider, if you're looking to move into aged care areas, then you will end up in possession of a large amount of personal information. PIPL will impact on the way that you operate. The second group are those in possession of information on critical infrastructure. Like Australia, we can define critical infrastructure very, very broadly. Telstra, for instance, has a foothold in Hong Kong. Will its operations be declared to be critical infrastructure in the same way that Huawei's operations in the telecom sector in Australia were declared to be critical infrastructure? Again, these are big company issues. They probably don't impact on all of those who are currently attending this webinar. But the third section does impact on us because PIPL applies to data processing outside of China. And as we noted before, it applies where it concerns the processing of personal data of any Chinese resident for the purpose of providing goods or services to the Chinese residents, or when it applies to analysing or evaluating the behaviour, that's the shopping, that's the consuming behaviour of Chinese residents. Before the introduction of PIPL, many companies used the EU standards, GDPR, as a way of protecting data. If we're doing it in Europe, then it transferred pretty easily and seamlessly to the Chinese environment. There wasn't any point in changing those settings, even though perhaps we could have got away with it. Now that's changed. However, there are some important differences between PIPL and the GDR, the General Data Protection Regulations coming out of Europe. Before PIPL, the lack of personal data protection law in China led to the broad adoption of the EU's GDPR as a privacy policy. For companies in possession of large amounts of personal information or of data on critical information infrastructure, it will be more difficult to transfer data from China to other countries due to the mandatory security assessment by the Cyberspace Administration of China. Now, currently, it's unclear whether such a security assessment will grant the company one-time approval for a data transfer or license it for a given period. Again, these might not directly impact on you, but if you are providing services to one of those groups that's providing a larger range of services, then the service that you provide to that third party will need to be compliant with PIPL structures. For those of you who are developing apps, who are developing software for use within China, then the PIPL standards are going to be particularly important. because this legislation is backed up with very substantial penalties. Remember our reference to social credit and the social credit environment. This becomes a game of company snakes and ladders, because your compliance with PIPL will either put you on a ladder upwards or put you on a slide downwards. Your social credit rating as a business can be impacted on the way that you comply or fail to comply with PIPL requirements. So in addition to fines for the entity, for the company, individual fines between 100,000 and 1 million yuan are also included. Violators of PIPL can be publicly called out on China's social credit system or be prohibited from doing business in China. And, like the European GDPR, the PIPL regulations provide individuals with the private right to action to be compensated for any losses suffered due to an improper handling or processing of personal information. Following the release of PIPL, the business community should identify those government agencies responsible for the enforcement of the new law and engage with them to observe regulatory constraints on cross-border personal information transfer. That, perhaps, is the primary risk that we face on a small scale. Let's not get too frightened here. For most of us, it's not going to be a big issue. However, we do need to be careful about how we approach trade expos, trade events, how we interact with Chinese consumers in collecting their data for future use in our business, how much we can on-sell or how much we can upsell. We will, to a significant extent, be controlled or constrained by what the platforms allow us to do. But that may require the development of new techniques, of new software, of new applications. We need to be aware of that and ready to move quickly. If you're operating in China, here are 5 compliance steps that you ought to consider. If your business is based in China and you are collecting personal information and data, storing it and using it, then you need to incorporate specific and separate consents upon every customer interaction. It might be done via a separate pop-up window or one interface with multiple check-the-box buttons for opt-in or opt-out. There are some other compliance steps that apply around external users, employment contracts, handbooks, etc. The details are there. And by the way, the full details are available as a PowerPoint printout of, as a PDF printout of this presentation. We started off with a broad overview of the environment, the context of these changes and of PIPL. And I did warn you at the beginning that there is a large text mountain looming in the distance. Text links and details of all that I have discussed are available in a PDF that will be sent to all participants. Make no mistake, the consequences of non-compliance with PIPL are harsh. And the passage of this legislation is just one indication that Chinese authorities are eager, very eager, to ramp up cyber and data enforcement. Companies that do business in China should seek legal advice as soon as possible to ensure compliance. So what are the key takeaways from today? There are 9 that we need to consider. First, perhaps the most important, PIPL applies to data processing outside of the PRC. In other words, you've sold goods or services into China and you've collected information about your customers and you are processing that information in Melbourne or in Sydney. PIPL applies to that process. You've sold a biometric into China, a watch or some app that tracks heartbeat or some physical or medical condition. The data that's collected is sent back to Melbourne or Sydney. PIPL applies. Second, if your company is based in China, there are significant compliance burdens involved in this legislation. Check it up. Make sure that you are compliant. Don't rely on slipping under the radar. Companies outside of China, based in Australia, that are targeting Chinese customers must develop compliant processes. If you're unable to show that your customer collection is compliant with PIPL, then you may be stopped from doing business. And that may be as simple as the payment gateway you use and the information that records. Perhaps the most basic point that is relevant is that informed customer consent is required for follow-up marketing activities. It's no longer good enough to have a fishbowl on your desk at CCIE or a trade show to collect business cards. Not that you do that anyway because it's so old-fashioned. But it's no longer acceptable to exchange WeChat business cards and then to follow up on those WeChat business cards unless there is an explicit consent or understanding of consent that that's going to occur. So you have to build opt-out or opt-in functions for all of your applications and all of your site services. That means that harvesting and using customer information for profiling becomes more difficult. Data scraping and random collection is not permitted or more difficult. Your business social credit rating may go up or down in a very visible fashion within this environment. Now, we don't know whether that's likely to apply to smaller foreign companies, like those operating out of Australia, or whether it really is a threat to larger tech monopolies. If you are actively involved in China or in doing business with China, which involves a collection of personal data on a large scale, you will need to establish a dedicated entity or appoint a representative within China to be responsible for PIPL compliance. Now, that's no different to what happens if you're operating in Europe or Singapore or elsewhere. These are the takeaways. Double. We need to be aware of them because the China environment, the digital environment, the e-commerce environment is changing, and how we use the data that's collected from that environment and how we can use it is also changing. As we noted in the beginning, our assumptions about privacy and how it actually applies or doesn't apply in China need some rethinking. We can't just dismiss these as irrelevant concerns or implementations that bear no relationship to what we're trying to do. These are significant changes in the digital landscape. They are part of a longer-term policy push towards common prosperity. They are part of clamping down on the entitled and the rich, as well as pushing up in the elimination of poverty. There will be more changes taking place. There's no question about it. Although China has a very advanced digital e-commerce environment, they are not prepared to let it go the same way, the same unfettered way as we see in the United States. So we need to understand the legislation, we need to understand the purpose of the legislation, and then we need to comply with that legislation. Thank you for your time and attention. We'll go to questions now.
Thank you so much, Daryl. I think there's a bit of a stunned silence. I think everybody's a little bit shocked. I do know a question has popped into the Q&A box here from Wayne Seeley. How do you see these PIPL laws impacting global cloud CRM and ERP type applications?
I'm very sorry, Virginia. My sound is disappearing at the moment. So can I ask you to sort of literally shout? I'm not too sure what happened, but we are in the middle of a thunderstorm here.
Oh, no problems. It's how do you see these laws impacting global cloud CRM and ERP applications?
They will have the same impacts as European GDPR laws. So there is an impact there, and this is part of this push for companies to be forced to hold their data within the China cloud versus holding data in the US cloud. And there's a bit of argy-bargy going on at an international level as to what's the most appropriate response to this. But at this stage, it doesn't appear to be directly targeted unless you're providing cloud services within the China environment.
Mm. And Daryl, I'm just thinking from a personal level, people who have LinkedIn accounts in Australia, I think LinkedIn is going to stop in China at some point soon. But if you do have Chinese people who are linked in with you and you are perhaps, I'm putting up an ACBC event, am I then breaching that law?
I'm taking it, my sound has gone really, really bad for some reason. So I'm taking a guess at what you're saying there. If you've got a Chinese representative in China who is responsible for IPL compliance, then they are the ones at risk, not yourselves. And that's the same as representative officers.
Mm. And what about LinkedIn? If you're using a LinkedIn account and putting things on it, going up into China?
Again, I'm sorry. I really am sorry. You're just really, really faint. I didn't quite catch all the question.
Oh, that's fine. Maybe Zach, are you able to have a better audio? Apologies to everyone for this.
Yeah, that's all right.
My audio is sitting up at maximum levels. So I said, I think it's partly because of the storm that's around.
Zach, I'm wondering if you could relay that one maybe more clearly.
Yeah, Virginia, you're coming through all right on my end.
Okay.
Right. My audio is going through, but your audio is not coming in. Most frustrating.
Okay. Daryl, can you read in the chat that Lily Wu has asked a question in chat? Can you?
Yes, certainly do that in chat. I'll stop sharing my screen. That may give us a solution. Oops, daisy. There we go. I'll jump out of that and go back to my main screen. So if you can stop sharing, that's probably the best way to go.
Okay. Yep, I'm on it, Daryl.
Okay, in terms of the chat screen. All right, so I've got both questions there. Let me start again from, how do you see the PIPL laws impacting global cloud CRM and ERP type applications? Potentially quite a significant impact, as I said before. At this stage, they're similar to operating under GDPR in Europe, and we know the limitations that are involved there. One of the key questions is going to be as to whether all that data is then transferred to an American environment and whether that will be permitted to happen. And that's an unresolved question at this stage. The second question, how do you see the PPL impact on Australian institutions that recruit Chinese students? Now, that's pretty significant. It depends on how much information that you are gathering about your student applications. Now, your recruiters in the Chinese environment will have to comply with PPIL requirements. So to that extent, you're able to pass the responsibility onto another group. However, we know that we use our student data, and particularly our data in the alumni situation, to reach out into another audience and consumer group. There will be limitations on that. The key factor is that you must be able to offer an opt-in, opt-out environment. Now, the next question is for someone using LinkedIn in Australia who has connections in China promoting ACBC events and so on. Will that law apply? Yes, it is extraterritorial in that environment. So we will have to give them the option of being able to opt in or opt out. And that's really the key. It's relatively simple in that respect. And we protect ourselves in that environment by giving that opt-in, opt-out environment. Now, if it's a website registration, that can be easily done. If we're collecting information at a stall or a booth at CIIE, that becomes a little bit more complex. And I'm not too sure, and no one's I've talked to has been able to give me a heads up on it as to how we can overcome that. Now, do we put up a general notice on the desk and on the display saying information collected may be used for unless you opt out, etc., etc.? That's a much more difficult process. So that's still a fuzzy area, and we're not too sure how that's going to impact as these laws have only just become active as of Monday. Okay, I'm reading this one again. Excuse me, peering into cameras here. One of the problems of wearing glasses. Business cards in the fishbowl. Is there a distinction between business information, contact name and address details, as compared to personal information, i.e. date of birth, residential address details, that would mean it's acceptable for overseas companies to collect this information for events? Let's be clear, there is no problems in collecting information per se. It's what you are allowed to do with that information that becomes the issue. So yes, you can collect all your business card information, names, addresses, telephone numbers, WeChat contacts, etc. But if you then wish to follow up with that for commercial purposes, for additional marketing, that requires, from what we can see at the moment, an opt-in clause. With an app, it's easy enough done. Trade Expo, that's a little bit more difficult to decide the structure that you're going to use. You need to make it very clear when you're collecting that data that the information can be used. Now, when we were running fishbowl competitions at trade expos, very old technology, people were very clear that we were collecting that information and that we would follow up, harass them, if you will, with offers to do this, to do that, to become subscribers, to buy this product, etc. And in fact, ACBC does that on a regular basis, and all of you who are registered today can expect follow-up information and contact from Virginia. Not a problem in Australia. However, unless there is an opt-in, it becomes more difficult in the China environment. So going back to ACBC, for those of you who are members, as you joined on your application form, there was a default option that said you agreed to receive additional information from ACBC. It appears under PIPL that we cannot use that default acceptance, that it must be an explicit consent for that information to be used in the future. How does it impact Australian universities who admit international students, since universities certainly have all the personal information? That is a significant issue to which I do not have an answer. It falls into this collection of almost biometric information, in the sense that the detailed information you have is much more than just name and contact number. You really need to sit down with developing legal structure around this as to how you can hold that information and what data protection security you must put on the way that information is held, and then the use to which you apply it. Now, in the PDF that will be sent to all members at the conclusion of today's event, there are a number of links in there to some legal opinions and discussion about what's happening. These obviously will be updated further and further as we go along, but they're the latest links as of this morning.
That is terrific, Daryl. We're actually at the end of our time. That has gone so fast.
I only have one more question to answer.
Oh, well, with everyone's, let's everyone hold on and let's keep going. One more answer. Good. Keep going.
Oh, right. That's just someone leaving for another meeting. So
oh, good. No,
another question to answer.
Brilliant. That was so interesting, Daryl. Thank you so much. For anyone who has any other questions, please contact us. We'll put you in touch with Daryl. His details will be on the handout that was sent to you following the event. So it's been extremely informative, riveting, in fact, and quite confronting, I think. So Daryl, enormous thanks for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. A recording, as I say, will be sent to all the attendees along with the summary. and Daryl's details and the presentation. Now, ACBC, as you know, is busy working in a variety of sectors for some other not to be missed information sessions. We are excited to join the Australian National University for their timely report launch and discussion on the impact of Chinese political trade sanctions on Australian industry, and that's next Tuesday. On the 17th of November, we have a 3-state hydrogen update, including special guest speaker from Fortescue Industries. And you know, I think that they are doing a huge investment in Queensland on hydrogen production. So that'll be an exciting one. We have a free business Chinese business language class, and details will be sent to you shortly on that. And also, I would just like to remind you that our National President, David Olsen, will be speaking at tomorrow's CII briefing with the Federal Trade Minister, Dan Tehan. So I'll be sure to register for that session. So without further ado, if you're not already a member, please sign up. We are a very busy and engaged organisation and have a lot to offer you. And I look forward to seeing you all in very, very soon, either in person or online. And in the meantime, thanks again, Daryl, and I hope everyone stays safe and well. Thank you so much.